I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis spoke to the Florida American Legion Boys State on Tuesday. Speaking about the Founding Fathers, Governor DeSantis named the quote, one thing he wishes the founders had done differently, namely impose term limits on members of Congress. DeSantis is sounding a familiar refrain as he has long been a proponent of congressional term limits. Widely considered a possible 2024 presidential contender, the Florida governor has more and more offered red meat to the base, which is pro-term limits. Let's listen in to his remarks.
Now, when I look at how to structure a government, I think the founders' basic insights are the best insights that anyone's made yet. The one thing that I think that I wish they would have done, and they considered this, but I wish they would have put term limits for members of Congress. And the reason why, the reason why, so at the time they were thinking about it and they called it rotation in office, and they were thinking, they're like, you know, I don't even know if people would want to serve. I mean, like, just think about it. They didn't have modern transportation, so you're going to get on a horse from South Carolina, and at the time it was Philadelphia, then New York, and then eventually it was Washington, D.C. But are you going to want to get on a horse and go back and forth to there? I mean, like, some would do it, but do you really want to do that for 30, 40 years? So I don't think that they really conceived of kind of this idea of somebody being in Congress for decades and decades. But what's happened, particularly in the last 50, 60 years, is, you know, people get in there, and their number one goal isn't to do great things for their district or the country. You know, I think some of them want to do those things, but their number one prerogative is to get reelected. And so that takes precedent over anything. So you end up with a situation where you've got a lot of these people in very high levels of the Congress who are in their 70s and 80s. And look, not that there's anything wrong with that, but they've been in Congress for 30 or 40 years. And I think they're very out of touch with what's going on in this country. That's one of the reasons why Congress is not well regarded as an institution. But the incentives are not to do the big things that really matter. Whereas I think if you had term limits, it's like, okay, you work hard to get elected. Say you get 3 two-year terms in the House. Okay, well, what are you going to have to show for it? You know, people are going to have an incentive to really want to get some stuff done. We have term limits here in the legislature in Florida. It's a much better system than what they have in Washington. So you have 4 two-year terms in the House and 2 four-year terms in the Senate, and that's all you can do. So someone gets elected in the House, they immediately work to see who's going to be the speaker for that class. So every 2 years there's a new speaker. Every 2 years there's a new Senate leader. What I think that incentivizes is it incentivizes the leaders of the legislature to say, okay, I've got a 2-year window. I want to be able to leave a legacy. I want to be able to advance my key priorities. And whether that politically is good or not is not their number one concern, because they're not going to be in that position after 2 years. And so if you look at how productive we've been in Florida, not just since I've been governor. I mean, we've had other productive times, but certainly since I've been governor, we've been more productive, I think, than any time in the history of the state, and more productive than any other state around the country. But part of the reason we're able to do that, I think, is because, you know, you got the leaders come in, they know the end of the ramp, no question about that. So let's get things done. And we've been able to get a lot done. And my view is, when you deal with the legislature, is, you know, I want them to be successful, particularly the leadership, on their priorities. It's got to be within reason. I mean, I'm not going to go out against some of my stated positions, and we got to make sure we're continuing to go in the right direction. You know, but there's certain things that are important to them. You know, I want to be supportive, and obviously we want them to support our agenda, but it's so much better to be able to do that. The other thing that you would, I think, in Washington that we have in Florida is we have a requirement to balance the budget every year. And if we have situations where we have a shortfall, then the legislature has to come in and they have to make adjustments about what they're doing. In Washington, the path of least resistance is just to charge it on the credit card. And that's what they do. I mean, just the last, 2 years, we've gone from 21 trillion to 30 trillion in debt. we literally, the first 200 years of our country, I think we had 4 or 5 trillion in debt. And then now we're doing massive, unfathomable amounts. And the reason is there's just no incentive to ever make a choice. If you're a member of Congress, politically, the easiest thing for you to do is to charge it on the credit card. If you raise people's taxes, and I'm not advocating that, but they don't like that. And so some of them are going to want to vote you out. If you reduce spending, well, the spending has constituencies. I mean, maybe there's a military program, maybe there's this, maybe there's that. Some people may not like that. So it requires them to make difficult choices. But, you know, when COVID hit Florida and hit the country in 2020, we actually were right in the middle of the legislative session. It started January 2020. Remember, back then, Fauci was saying, you know, this is not a big deal. The media was saying, worry more about the flu. So that's what's happening in like February of 2020 as we get into March. So they're working on the budget. They're doing this. And then right as the budget became due is when you started to see a lot of the craziness where professional sports leagues were stopping, theme parks, all this other stuff. So I have this budget on the desk, which really was reflective of a reality in which the economy was going to continue to be strong and it was not necessarily going to be deterred with COVID, to now in a situation where, you know, my tourism industry is in jeopardy. I have all these issues. And so we took the budget. It wasn't due till July 1st. I waited till the end of June. And we vetoed what was then a record $1 billion in vetoes. And there were things that were really good in there that I vetoed. But I just made the point that, look, we can't have a shortfall. We need to make sure that we're making the ends meet here. The fiscal, the creditworthiness of state, all that's very, very important. So that was the right thing to do. It turned out, because we were open, you know, you started to see that revenue really, really pick up. And we've had massive amounts of revenue pouring in because of all the economic activity. But that is just the reality of what you have to do. If Washington, if they were forced to do that, you know, I think you'd see them make a lot of different decisions, and it would not necessarily be mortgaging the future of the next generation. You know, I will say this, when I was your age, people talked about the national debt. I was a congressman for 3 terms. We talked about it. We tried to, at least I was trying to do something about it. And there was always predictions of doom that, well, if we go another trillion in debt, there's going to be doom. And I would accept those. But I think it's because we've done so much debt over the last 20 years, and you have not necessarily had a debt crisis that I think people just assume, well, you can just go ahead and keep doing this. I don't think that that's ultimately going to be the case. I mean, I think eventually you got to pay the piper. And if it was just a matter of just charging everything on a credit card, well, heck, let's just charge another $5 trillion, right? I mean, like, if that's were the case. But I don't think that's how it works. So eventually, I think there's going to be a reckoning on this. I can't tell you when. If you would have told me 10 years ago that we may go to 30 trillion, I would have said no way. I would have said that would have been a huge, huge problem. But yet here we are. But having some type of requirement to make sure that these legislators have to make tough decisions, I think is important. I think term limits would help too, because they wouldn't be so concerned about being reelected. But those are 2 things structurally that I think are very, very important.